Well, you're still standing or you're still sitting, but the phrase may work. You're probably exhausted. So if I start to see you guys faint, I'm just going to say, okay, I think that's enough. It's certainly not a linear set of observations or comments. I did want to start with Franz and thank him, because I know sometimes we seem overly hopeful about how we can change the world, but I honestly do believe there are ways we can change discourse. And I think that what Franz offered us last night was an understanding that empathy and cooperation is phylogenetically very pervasive. It isn't even something particularly unique to people, though the way in which we live in a world of mental social relationships and worrying about and being concerned with the other constantly in our lives is probably unprecedented for other species. I wanted to thank Frances particularly for her remarkable presentation, of course, and I ask you to forgive me if I misinterpret. I took lots of notes and was trying to absorb it very, very quickly. It's a little bit new for me, but I think I got some points and wanted to compare them, oddly enough, to some of the points that Katie made that were also so brilliant. You began with really a remarkable set of questions that not only unified the day or were the questions around which most of us would be concerned, but it actually is the conference. And I believe you said, if I caught it, how does variation in pre- and postnatal experiences lead to variation in the development of the brain? And a second question you had is, can these developmental effects persist across generations? And your third question was, which was so beautifully addressed by practically all the speakers, which is very unusual that both proximate and evolutionary questions would be answered. You asked, Frances, what is the adaptive significance within and between these differences? And Katie, it was an amazing, eye-opening experience, both reading your papers and being introduced to your work on breastfeeding. And I've really never seen, I've been around breastfeeding research a long time, I've never seen the questions being asked so beautifully and in such an important and new way. We thought we were all radical when we came up with discussions of breastfeeding, when we recognized that it wasn't just about the breast milk, but it's about breast milk delivery, the social engagement, the sensory contact, the turn-taking, the sensory relationship, the attunement issues. And, you know, we were radically and excited and proud of ourselves for thinking about the different kinds of milk, gestationally defined milk that mothers' bodies can make when their babies are born early, and the foremilk, the mid-milk, the aft milk, there's nighttime milk that has more fat, and there's daytime milk. And, you know, these were steps in this progress. But I just want you to know that all together, you chipped away a lot at that iceberg. There's still a lot of it underneath there, but, you know, I think you have set a line of research that's going to be so promising and so really valuable. Katie showed, in my mind, my simple way of summarizing, that we have to kind of move beyond the simple idea of understanding the synthesis of milk, and even to a certain extent, what's in it, move beyond it to really understanding what the baby does with it and how the baby uses it, how the calories are absorbed and how it, you know, is assimilated by the infant, and how and why, and this was a corpus of her talk, which was done so beautifully, it can affect behavioral patterns in the ways in which she both objectively and subjectively evaluated them and then showed us what those correlations were with respect to this. And Frances, again, I think that was such a wonderful little clarification for those of us that might be squeamish about, you know, rodents licking each other and say, oh, just think of it as touch. It was a very rich moment for me. That's exactly right. What is important is the contact, and now we know by virtue of your work and others, you know, how really important that touching is. In a very odd way, I found a parallel between what you and Katie were doing insofar as Frances argued for the importance of high licking and grooming that led to, in this behavioral phenotypic kind of way, less stressed adults, more effective mothering, more sexually receptive individuals, hitting the adaptive significance issue yet again. And it was focused around, of course, the increased estrogen receptor. In addition, Katie was showing, of course, that the high-yield energy-available mothers were producing these changes, these behavioral phenotypic changes, boldness, or I don't know if curiosity was one of them, Katie, but certainly affecting the status and the rank of these individuals, if not their health. So these models seem oddly parallel to me a little bit. A point that came up early this morning and that seemed to keep getting reiterated through the day was the importance of constant, stable environments. And you made that point again too, Francis, as did Barry this morning. Provides consistently, you argued, good mothering in succeeding generations, and you made the point that intergenerational transmission requires these stable environments for those generated traits or characteristics. I also took note, I can find my own notes here. Oh, here it is. I liked your acknowledgement of this guy behind me. I was trying to anticipate what you all might be talking about, but today was different. I had to forage and integrate what you really said versus what I thought you might. You said, you called it experience-dependent inheritance. And I've always lamented this in my teaching. I don't know if you have. I always felt bad for Lamarck, because one day I did write this, or read this essay that turned me around on him, and he was a brilliant guy. It was a very radical contention to see life in continuity and contiguous. And he actually was the first to suggest that we absolutely evolved from the apes. And he even used the term evolution. And that whole notion, getting away from Aristotelian, the fixity of species, was really introduced into the scientific literature by him. And, he's always been taught in kind of a ludicrous way. We laugh and scoff at his giraffe idea. You stretch the neck a little longer and lo and behold, the next offspring, has a little longer neck. But the guy was really brilliant in this, methylation and epigenetics is in a small, minor way. It's altering the way we have to do Mendelian genetics, or at least think about how correct the Mendelian genetics explanations have been. So I really wanted to have you look at him and just appreciate, that he really did make some scientific contributions, so we won't keep laughing at him, etc. So here are some, again, very non-linear observations, little moments for me that will help us get on with it. I have a little presentation, but I'm not sure you're really up to seeing it because you look pretty weary out there. But early this morning, Barry was talking about cultural niche construction. I think that's how you put it. And similarly, coming back to Darsh's presentation about the developmental niche construction, I found Lee's, Dr. Gettler's little example of, I guess it was Martin Bowler's work, Lee, where he showed I always have a problem with this, the toga and the Hazda. And if you remember, there was a very interesting point where culture really has something to do with what the fathers themselves are valuing. You might note that what Lee showed was that there was no difference between the men in terms of testosterone when the dads became fathers, etc. Whereas for the Hazda, there was significant differences that were shown. Is that correct, Lee? Am I reporting that? All right. Hazda. Say it? Hadza, H-A-D. Thank you. Okay, Hadza. And I think that really shows the powerful transaction that takes place between, cultural values and ideologies and the biology that seems to be ready at any minute to accommodate, what the organism in this case is thinking, feeling, etc. in relationship to the baby. Let's see. So, placenta. Oh, I think it's very interesting how, in some ways, I think we need to reconceptualize. I was talking to Katie outside about this, to reconceptualize our simplistic notions of sometimes what's good or what's bad, or down-regulation is bad, up-regulation is good. Because what also came out several times today, in very important ways, is the importance of context. That things have to be judged within the context within which it's occurring. And it reminded me of, if I'm saying this term correctly again, is it allostasis? Allostasis. In a way, the classic example of it is high blood pressure. But the alternative is you don't have high blood pressure, you're probably going to die because you're not going to be getting enough oxygen. And so systems accommodate to what is potentially optimal given the situation it is facing or encountering. And again, I think sometimes we use Western notions of good, bad, right, wrong, day, night too easily, in a sense. And if anything we're learning, particularly from Lee's hormonal data, is it isn't always in the traditional interpretations of what up and down means or having this hormone or not, and it's true for cortisol. Cortisol, Francis, you were saying, 80% is metabolized or prevented from getting in to the fetus, but yet the 20% that is important for respiratory development, et cetera. So, and of course, you probably all know that about cortisol, and Katie talked about it in terms of being important in terms of metabolism and so on and so forth as well. But I mean, that's an easy observation, trying to be careful about simplistically thinking that we can assess the merits or the values without understanding context. I, too, was making the observation quite independently to get to Dr. White's comment. I was really thinking about this last night, that for all the ways in which we deprive babies and children of what might be really, biologically speaking, more optimal, we really do pretty well. And it just does remind us that the body always strives toward adaptation. And I don't mean that in a genetic sense, but in acclimatization, let's say, the body does strive toward balance. And it makes the best out of a fairly unpredictable world, and one that isn't always optimal. And I guess it speaks well to simply organismic resiliency. Not to deny what Darsha's talking about and how we have at our disposal ways of really changing the way we live that really would have real and lasting positive effects on our quality of life. I thought I'd go forward now, if you can take this. I wanted to talk to the politics of it a little bit, about what is it about our legacy that we, yes, I'm not on the mic, am I? Okay. What it is about our legacy that we do want to retain, and what models will we actually use, etc. And this is from some of Sarah Hrdy's work, and I've always loved this line. I have to remind myself, because don't forget, I've used the evolutionary narrative myself to justify all the questions I've asked with respect to sleep and feeding issues, etc. But looking back to see forward is, of course, the little byline for anthropologists particularly, but unless acknowledged and understood, ancient legacies can prove inconvenient to our efforts to chart the future. And recall that, and this was Sarah's famous line, natural selection did not stop dead in its tracks when the Pleistocene ended. We are kidding ourselves if we think so. A mother today, whether in New York, Tokyo, or Dhaka, is not just a gatherer caught in a shopping mall without her digging stick. So I guess what we're talking about in the issue came up several different places today too. Maternal agency. Human mothers must evaluate or decide when and if it is a right time to invest. This is a very important guiding evolutionary principle. And recall that, another line from Sarah's work, continuous contact, proximity, and caring, which we tend to idealize, I certainly do. Caring may be what infants want, but it might not be what mothers want, or more importantly, what they can provide. I had the honor of being critiqued by this woman here, Bernard Hausman, and it was wonderful to read your work being positively, critiqued, and it was called Stone Age Mothering. And it was about easily describing optimally what our babies could best experience for that maximum optimal brain development. But it is true that not all mothers live in the same context, there's that context again, and have access to the same kinds of resources. This was a woman that did breastfeed and co-sleep. She went to all the La Leche meetings. In fact, she heard me speak, and that's where she started reading my work from a lecture I gave at the international meeting. She says, while scholars who use the evolutionary narrative based in science are basically right in a scientific sense, put into play, The evolutionary perspectives function rhetorically, operating in predictable ways to focus attention on the infant's needs and experiences, seeming to ignore the mother and her role as an agent in the process, sort of pursuant to your comment. So, stepping back a little bit, one question we constantly should be asking, especially us anthropologists, is, do evolutionary narratives and/or evolutionary rhetoric promote or hinder maternal agencies? And it's probably like many things in life, it's probably a two-edged sword. It takes balancing. Validate maternal choices, place decision making in the home where it belongs, provide access to unbiased information, search for appropriate scientific explanations, but without providing ammunition for essentialist arguments concerning a woman's place. And you do hear some of that kind of dialogue and discourse when we discuss these kinds of issues. This is rather wordy, but I thought this was clever, you wouldn't want to miss it, that Hausman wrote. She said, the evolutionary narrative suggests that it is the female body, interesting to think of this way, that has not evolved, that it is essentially primitive, maintained in its 400,000-year-old state, while essentially non-modern, but primitive. Women have always breastfed and through the night. She says the male body has also not changed, since it is limited to the genetic transfer, but it is not implicated in this evolutionary narrative in the same way as a woman's is, not so much hampered by its evolutionary state. But given Dr. Gettler's findings, I mean, at least they can become part of the conversation, because the point that Dr. Gettler made is that men would not be significantly having their testosterone reduced in these different stages if it were not important, and if it wasn't, yet again, another example of our bodies and natural selection assuring that our infants get the most from a parent that counts. So at least his research brings that possibility here. And I said here, does Dr. Gettler's research in perspective, and you haven't read his paper in the American Anthropologist, it justifies or that puts a context to much of his laboratory work. Male sharing and caring throughout human evolution lead us to think more seriously about the equality of the sexes in both biological and social and political terms. And then she says, after all, what allowed me to continue, and Hausman's referring to herself, to nurse my son and to work at a demanding career, she's a professor, was not simply my commitment to breastfeeding and co-sleeping, but certainly more significantly the flexibility of my job situation and the resources available to me in my home. And this is a very powerful sentence below. She says, if one could call my maternal practices evocative of the ancestral pattern, it was only because I was able to marshal significant resources to realize such processes. So there's always been an interesting tension even in my own work with respect to having early on in my career discovered that alloparenting was a very important phenomenon in primate evolution. I've been arguing for years, as many of you know, about the importance of the mother-infant dyad to be seen as a singular unit, accepting Bowlby's and others individuals' ideas about there is no such thing as a baby, there's a baby and a mother, and that relationship is not just a social construction, it's a biological reality, and it's actually both. And so I've had to myself in my rhetoric really push that unit as a physiological system. And I've always thought, Sarah's been a friend of mine for many years, that I noticed she'd rarely ever talk about my papers, and I suddenly realized, and I had a nice conversation with about her, it was as if the only way you could read it is to say, oh gosh, the alloparents don't count. But I was using a rhetorical strategy, because I knew that physicians and medical people in front of whom I was lecturing, it was a radical proposition to even talk about the dyad as a scientific unit of analysis. Now, if I'm going to then step back, of course, and say, well, wait a minute, it's also those alloparents. That wasn't the argument of the day for that moment. But it is this interesting kind of fusion that's required to understand what does go on that's so critical in this relationship, and yet in the larger, broader human evolutionary context of substitute caregivers that really did, as once again Dr. Gettler talked about, helped reduce the birth interval by saving energy for mothers who could return to ovulation. this is just I don't know where this thought comes in, but it comes with thinking about these issues for years. And with Frances' work and Katie's work, the distance between our genes and expressed behavior has just in the last decade or so become very much longer. Another observation for me would be, are human neonatal emotions and behavior the closest we will ever get to our human genes, and thus a kind of universal human? It's pre-verbal, pre-unculturated, and I think I invented a new word, pre-lactated. That is to say, it's not interpreting, it's not evaluating, it's not worried. I mean, it's really an enormously interesting phase of human life that every baby in the world for a very brief period of time will do exactly the same thing physiologically if you give them the same sensory stimulation. And they won't think about it, they won't evaluate it, they won't judge you. But their bodies respond in a much more universal way. Culture changes that. When we start, our cognitive systems, our emotional, social systems begin to develop, for sure. But there is that very brief period where there is a commonality that may not ever quite reach that level when one thinks of humans as a general species. And this is just a thought I've had recently. I use Myron Hofer's work. He argued about many things brought up here today, about hidden regulatory mechanisms. Just because you don't see things going on, they are there. And particularly for altricial mammals, those undeveloped, and for mammals in general, this notion of the dyadic interchange and sensory regulation is really very critical. He had a profound effect on my career, I'm sure, for many of the people in this room. In one way or another, his work was significant. I'll never forget his little anecdote that he told about Schonberg, I guess was the one telling it, where they couldn't figure out why these rat pups stopped growing, and they had put them in little environments that mimicked everything the mothers were giving them, and they just stopped growing. And the graduate student one weekend that was taking care of them decided that one way to clean the caves was to use his pencil top, the eraser, and just move the bodies of the pups around with the pencil, scooting them around the cage. And they measured the pups on Monday or Tuesday, whenever it was, and they had all gained weight. And so the graduate student was put on the firing line. What did you do? What did you do? And he said, nothing. I just used the pencil to move the pups around. And they figured out that was what was releasing the whatever the prohormone was, I think, that permitted the growth hormone to be released. And it was just an amazing, fortuitous example. Well, I thought I could contribute something in terms of looking at the ways in which cultural decisions, if you will, can put infants in different trajectories, on different trajectories. And depending upon, in a certain amount of, reality, getting to Darsh's point, what happens when children are breastfed and sleep together? Can you make predictions, or can you see associations between their emotional, psychological, social lives? Many of you probably have heard what I have heard, and everyone here is never sleep with your baby, for example, because you're going to create a dependent infant. You're going to create a child that is a little bit messed up with respect to gender identity. You're going to create, this is another one, you'll create a child that will be, quote, spoiled, will cry a lot, be crabby, so on and so forth. There's many little ways to do it. So I was asked last year at the American Association of Physical Anthropologists to put my work together to see if there are any long-term effects of co-sleeping. And fortunately, in the last decade or two, once again, we're getting for the first time information that can help answer this question. So I looked at basically a group, certain age grades to see. And you all know this, I'm not going to spend any time answering it, but I backed up a little bit. Where are they supposed to sleep? The body of the mother is the only habitat. They're not supposed to sleep like this, even though this is the idealized, American kind of dream, sleep through the night. And if you're an adult, you want to sleep like a baby. Well, the truth of it is, sleep like a baby means feed, sleep, wake, sleep, feed, wake all night long. That's really what a sleep like a baby means, and that was only made possible by, of course, cow's milk that sustained these babies for those long periods of time. The truth of it is, and everyone in this room would likely agree, that the human infant's natural habitat is the mother's body, the only environment to which a baby is adapted. It's not adapted to the grass or outside or anything else. It's everything that mother and or father provides. Nutrition, warmth, movement, touch, of course, smells and gas, the whole works. And these are the actual attributes and systems that the baby is adapted to by way of prenatal experiences for which it's already prepared to engage after life. This baby is almost in a violent world right now. Let me just put it dramatically. It is getting bombarded by touch impulses, by smelling its mother's breast milk, by feeling mother's vesicular air move over its face, breathing in carbon dioxide and having its chemoreceptors drive its phrenic nerve to breathe just a little bit faster. It's every sensory modality is ongoing, and this baby's brain is engaged and responding to that. Think of the baby that's sleeping down the hall completely in a sensory deprived environment, and the accumulated missed experiences that a baby like this is going to get versus the other. This is a beautiful picture, again, that's sleeping like a baby image, and yet it's a remarkably full, dynamic, second-to-second exchange between the baby and the mother, etc. And years ago, I made this statement, social care is synonymous with physiological regulation. I was so proud of myself. I think I was the only one in the universe that really liked that and really got it. But there is no social behavior with babies. It's all physically based and sensorially based. But it's what the baby can, as you know, can respond to. And that's a beautiful rendering of where babies are to be expecting to be found and put. And these beautiful pictures, the woman on your left and the woman on your right, their babies are essentially the same little baby. They don't know yet, they're in different cultures, and they're receiving the same sensory stimulation, and they are responding to it in pretty much precisely the same way. This isn't to diminish genetic variability. I know these are two little individuals that will have two little sleep personalities and be their own people, but that will come, that will be developed, that will be expressed later. But right now, they're exactly the same. Some of you will know I co-opted Dobzhansky's favorite little expression here. Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. I've loved that phrase. I finally found a way to use it in my own work. Nothing a human infant can or cannot do makes sense at all except in light of the mother's body. Even how far they see, what they can smell, how their heart works and how they learn to breathe. It's all connected to mother's body. This is what people do. This is a little ethnographic vignette. And I love this picture precisely because it's so uncontrolled. And this was a little surprise to Lee and I. We published a popular article in Mothering magazine on what we've learned about co-sleeping. And they asked parents to send in these beautiful pictures and created this lovely montage. I got in trouble, and so did Lee, for this montage because all the first candle people wrote back and say, how could you be so irresponsible to publish such terrible conditions and situations for babies to be found in, And I wrote back and said, I find these pictures to be a gift. This is what people do. There may be unsafe sleeping arrangements here, but perhaps this is an educational opportunity to say, what is it that parents might need to know if indeed they are really dangerous? But to have a reaction of that, this is a disgusting presentation, tells me more about them than it tells me about unsafe sleeping environments. But I did this little research project where I wanted to see, as I was just mentioning, whether there's linkages. What happens a little bit later to these presumably co-sleeping, but I don't know and I can't disentangle the feeding issue from the sleeping issue. But what's fascinating is I'm blanking on her name, but Katie Ramus actually studied mothers to find out which mothers in our culture are likely to co-sleep. And it turned out to be rather counterintuitive to what she expected. She divided the moms up into two types. It was a pretty good sample there. a collectivist mother and what you call the individualist mother. A collectivist mother was people that valued connections to the community and interdependence when spoken of, and was very much sensitive to social critique and varying from the cultural norm. Whereas the individualist mothers, who ended up being the ones that made the decision to co-sleep, believed in autonomy and individuality, but not insofar as the sleep environment for their babies. So it was very interesting. There was a type of mother, and I want to come back to this a little bit later, but keep that in mind. But once a choice is made, the sleeping arrangement and method of feeding assert long-term influences independently. So I've always used this little chart, and this is a little pre-chart, so to speak, to say that once a baby is found to be within relative distance of a parent, whatever it is, every single one of these variables, the traditional variables measured for sleep architecture, for feeding, it is radically different. And it really does, the closer the baby gets, the more significant usually number counts of various issues, but they don't always change in the same direction, but they're very, very different. This is a little baby that's sleeping alone. I wish I could show you. I've never gotten this to work in a public presentation, but you should see it over here. Anyway, but this is the solitary sleeping baby. This is a mother that all night long was the most amazing film to watch. She gently wakes up, she looks at her baby like she's looking at an angel, and she gently kisses that baby. And when she kisses that baby, the baby moves its face up, opens its eyes for a split second, then goes right back to sleep. And what's so amazing is thinking about the crib baby, if that's a sustained experience. And this is a breastfeeding mother too, thinking of what accumulated over months this child is getting and how that's affecting this child's brain and all of the things that you and I would be interested in for defining biologically, etc. Dr. Gettler and I did this little analysis to see how different for the routine bed sharing mothers and babies, how different they feed. This is a population that shouldn't be very different. They are all exclusive breastfeeders. And look at the difference that was caused simply by sleep location. That these babies every night were getting between about 4 and sometimes 9 feeds versus a breastfeeding baby who is getting 2 or less. The intervals, the average time between the breastfeeds was remarkably long, as you would probably imagine. If frequency is going down, then the average interval would be getting longer and longer. Once again, just an expectable pattern. Well, on the right there, and many of you know these distinctions, we have through the years been fortunate enough to study through polysomnography, what these changes have been with respect to the typical kinds of variables that are examined in more traditional sleep studies. That's to say a bottle-fed solitary sleeping baby, which, by the way, all the clinical models of normal infant sleep are still based on the solitary bottle-fed baby. So it's a really kind of crazy that way. But you can see light sleep rather than deep sleep and less crying behavior and just jumping around, sleep-wake synchrony. Here is something that I think is very important, though. 60% of all maternal arousals during bed sharing are explained by the infant having aroused first within plus or minus 2 seconds, and 40% of all the infant arousals during bed sharing are explained by the mother having aroused within plus or minus 2 seconds. The kind of intermeshing biological social is just really remarkable. That's one of the very significant findings that we have. It has implications for oxygenation, for the duration of any given sleep bout in a particular stage of sleep. So this is, from arousals, that sort of is what is the micro-unit basis of the larger numerical differences that we found. And even little apneas and little events in the bed. When something happens, the mom or baby would hold their breath for a few seconds. It wasn't really a central apnea, but a purposeful volitional apnea. Hey, what's going on kind of thing. That's very, very typical. But again, even the intermeshing of the breathing cycles and the minutes per breaths per minute were very much related to each other, that we could predict which babies and mothers were sleeping together by looking at their average breaths per minute. But there were these interesting mathematical relationships. And to illustrate that synchronicity, we looked at the amount of time that mothers and babies were sleeping together, that they were doing exactly the same thing at the same time. So what we found is that 42% of the time, mothers and babies were in the same awake or sleep stage. This is called simultaneous activity time, compared with about 29% of the time that the mothers and babies would be doing the same thing but sleeping in different rooms. So there is an organizational contribution, not unexpectedly. If two adults sleep together, there's likely a contribution that each makes, and you reset your sleep. If someone wakes you up, you both enter into stage 1 sleep, or if with babies, they enter into some other stage of sleep, etc. And there's a whole variety of changes. I just want you to know this is there in relationship to that little creature up there. And the most important finding, I believe, in all of the findings we made, was the average duration that babies, when they sleep with their mothers and breastfeed through the night, the average amount of time they spend in the deepest stages of sleep. The reason that's significant is a very important suspected cause of sudden infant death syndrome is an arousal deficiency, that the babies have their normal apneas, and the protective mechanism is to awake and breathe, and that breaks the apnea. So it's suspected that about perhaps as many as 40% of babies that die of SIDS just simply don't have a good mechanism for getting awake. And that's damaged by smoking during the gestation or during the time in the womb. But their arousal mechanisms are poor. You don't want to design a sleep environment for babies that push them, if they're arousal deficient, to spend a great amount of time in the stage of sleep for which they're unable to protect themselves. So does all this constant contact and sensory regulation of the infant at such a critical period in neurological development sensitize the infant brain to look for, respond faster and more efficiently to signals and cues, perhaps changing something about the psychological profile of the offspring? So here's our little group again. And as again, I want to be honest about, I can't disentangle the breastfeeding, the feeding method. So I just showed you things that happen to our baby, our little infant here. The confluence of repeated nightly rich sensory regulation. It's sort of a potpourri of all kinds of sensory experiences of the baby. So let's jump right away, and I'll come back to baby in a minute, to the studies that have been done on toddlers that have co-slept from birth in relationship to the babies that have not. Co-sleepers, toddlers, are more secure being left alone, are able to initiate problem solving in the absence of an adult. That's a study by Goldberg and Keller, very recent. Co-sleepers have fewer tantrums, more in control of emotions, less fearful, are happier. That was that finding by Heron. Increased cognitive capacity of 60-year-olds bed-sharing children, a very recent study that was done. Co-sleepers have less at the age of when they're young adults, and this was really fascinating, very consistent, that one study showed on military bases, children all start sleeping with the spouse that's left behind. And what happened is the captain of this military base was very concerned. They thought this was a massive pathology that they had to do something about. So they hired 3 very good epidemiologists to study this phenomenon and to see if there's any correlations between behavioral patterns or pathologies and the child sleeping with the parent when the other parent left for duty. And what they found was completely the opposite, that the children that co-slept in the absence of the parent were, had all the high score, comportment scores, had better grades, and they were underrepresented in the psychiatric population, such that the 3 investigators who originally proposed pathology said this is a really good thing, it should be encouraged for children, etc. Co-sleeping women as children had higher self-esteem and confidence and comfort with intimacy and physical contact in general. That's Crawford's study. And then Lewis and Janda found co-sleeping males have higher self-esteem, less anxiety and less fearfulness, report more frequent sex. I don't know if that's a good one or not. Females more comfortable also with intimacy and also higher self-esteem. And now this is probably the least controlled that none of these studies were, but Jeff Mosenkus did a big study out of the University of Chicago and found that co-sleepers reporting as adults report being more optimistic, more connected to their families, and more satisfied with their lives in general. So less fearfulness, higher self-esteem, more comfort with affection and intimacy, increased sex, stronger sense of well-being. Here are the sort of descriptors of what is found for individuals compared with solitary sleepers. So in summary, continuities are set in motion intergenerationally from decisions about infant care practice that reflect how mothers interact with her own cultural environment. Remember Katie Ramos's study, including decisions about whether or not, in this case, to co-sleep, that potentially impact their infants and children physically and behaviorally, as the studies here suggest, potentially replicating in those children the very attributes that led their mothers to make those decisions in the first place. Recall the first mother's decision to breastfeed and co-sleep with her infant. Co-sleeping, the babies are more touched, they're more reassured, they're more communicated with. The toddlers, the young kids are happier, by mothers' reports, less fearful, more confident to make new friends, to dress themselves, to be alone, to solve problems. The young adults are, generally speaking from these studies, comfortable with affection, they have higher self-esteem. They seem to continue, as they get to be adults, to be less fearful, they're more optimistic, they trust their own judgments, and finally they become, in a sense, the very parents that they had insofar as their decisions to sleep with their children, a kind of a mutually reinforcing system. So it was very interesting just to see, this isn't exactly the way you'd be looking for correlates, biological correlates that we can really trace the pathways, etc. But if these psychological advantages or characteristics or traits are real, and through the years I am certain now that there will be opportunities to really study children, longitudinal effects of co-sleeping, it certainly offers some good information that at very least can counter the kinds of armchair speculations about what, even for Western children, co-sleeping and bed sharing lead to. So that's it from me. So I don't imagine you probably care to ask any questions, but you're certainly welcome to. Okay.